Ladies and gentlemen, on everyday basis, for the last several years, I've been developing the electronic database of supernatural entities in the Babylonian Talmud. And when I was invited to speak at this at the present conference, I immediately asked myself, are the accounts I am dealing with in any way horrifying? This question led to several other questions, and ultimately the question how to measure the literary horror. And what follows is a report of a kind of a mental exercise, how much data can be squeezed from apparently irrelevant categories in my database, from apparently non-horror work and performed by a person who is apparently not a specialist in horror studies. Now, the first question was how to define horror, and after doing a quick and dirty review of what I believe are some classical works in this subject, I found several ideas which resonated well with my gut feeling of what horror is. The first such idea was that horror is a special combination, a mixture of fear and disgust. It's not enough to have something fearful. It has to be at the same time disgusting, and this mixture should be understood in a way, in a kind of a synergy. Taken together, they are different than simple sum of things. The second important notion was that in order for horror to work, it has to be probable. In other words, the events described in horror narratives must be probable. They must appear as something which could have taken place. Otherwise, it is too distant and it loses its power. And finally, and as a kind of a homage to HPL, I found his idea of unknown and mystery. In other words, horror has to strike the right balance between what is revealed, what is known, what is probable, and what is unspeakable, beyond comprehension, which is simply a mystery. Now, taken together, all these components, I concocted the complex idea of horror understood as fourfold structure, consisting of fear, disgust, mystery, and reality. What is very important, I wanted to avoid the problems associated with simple binary dichotomies, so I treated horror as a measure in total, as well as each component as a kind of a continuum. In other words, we can, when measuring a horror, instead of simply saying that something is or is not a horror, we can indicate how intense is this feeling of horror is, and conversely, how intense are the specific components of this general horror. In other words, we need some opposites: fear and tranquility, disgust and attraction, mystery and explicitness, reality and unreality. In result of measuring horror this way, we can get a hierarchy of horror narratives. We can order them from the least horrifying to the most horrifying. Now, the second question was, can we assess the Babylonian Talmud as a horror narrative? Now, Babylonian Talmud is obviously a large, complex corpus of texts. According to the very recent, by recent I mean the last decades of scholarship, according to the modern standards, it has its authors. Its authors can be localized in very specific times and places, often quite distant from each other, because we have this time span of several centuries in composition. Babylonian Talmud, understood this way, can be located in the broader background of Jewish and Aramaic literature. As such, it transmits certain ideas, it pushes them forward. Obviously, it meets the criteria of literature. Next, it deploys a number of literary genres which have been in use in these times. In other words, the formal structures employed by the authors of the Babylonian Talmud were the ones which were quite popular in the era. Finally, although the Babylonian Talmud concerns mainly the idea of morality, pedagogy, it is supposed to serve as a kind of indicator or repository of role-playing models. It answers the general question how to to be a proper adherent of rabbinic Judaism, it nevertheless tackles a broad range of subjects, and at least in theory, it concerns every imaginable sphere of human life, also these ones which are less than pleasant. In sum, we can say that the Babylonian Talmud is a piece example of literature, and despite its main purpose, or in order to execute its main purpose, it utilizes various emotions. Quite often humor, but quite often fear and disgust. In other words, the Babylonian Talmud can be analyzed as a literature, and we can search for the notion of horror in there. Now, the next question is how to measure this notion of horror. Now, let's say we have this very short account from the Babylonian Talmud, which speaks about a certain rabbi who creates an artificial man, a kind of a golem, and sends this golem to his colleague. At first glance, we can say, well, everything appears quite probable. We have particular names of sages. Everything is described in a way which suggests that it might have taken place. The story is uncanny, at least according to modern standards. It evokes some fear, maybe some disgust experience when you have something which resembles a human but ultimately is not. But the question is, what kind of a yardstick, if you please, can we use to measure the intensity of horror? And this is where I want to connect with the project I am working on, which is the electronic database of angels, demons, ghosts, and monsters in the Babylonian Talmud. And this database is structured as follows. It is a spreadsheet. In the spreadsheet, we have particular fragments from the Babylonian Talmud divided into strictly annotated units. Each unit is annotated using a number of categories pertaining to its formal qualities and its contents. Database has two main functions. First, it serves as a thematic concordance, something which has a very, very long tradition in the humanities. Using this database, you can easily find all the fragments tackling specific subject or speaking about a given supernatural entity or types of supernatural entities. But what is new and what is very, I would say, very modern about this database is that it allows performance of various types of calculations. In other words, you can measure frequency of specific entities or specific subjects. You can correlate specific subjects with specific entities, with specific formal features, and so on and so forth. Now, the database utilizes a quite a broad range of categories which pertain both to formal features and to the contents. And the question I ask myself while preparing this presentation is which of these categories are relevant, which can be used to measure horror. Now, the operationalization process which followed has several steps. First of all, I took this idea of horror I had previously concocted and unpacked it. And as I said, every component of this horror compound can be approached as a kind of a continuum. So we can find appropriate places when, let's say, we analyze certain passage, we can assess whether it's fearful, disgusting, mysterious, and so on and so forth. The next step was to find the categories present in the database which are relevant for particular components. In other words, I wanted to find which categories which are already there indicate specific components of this horror complex. And after some brainstorming, I recovered a number of categories which I believe indicate this horror complex. Now, to give you several examples, let's say we have a component of fear. And in the database, it is indicated by the presence of specific thematical hashtags. For instance, when a supernatural entity is gigantic, and when it is dangerous, when it is voracious, or when the given account speaks about a large number of supernatural entities, we can take it as indicating fear as evoking fear in humans. When you encounter something which is gigantic, hungry, and there is lots of such figures, well, you have the full biological right to feel at least some level of fear. Conversely, and as I said, we have this continuum. There are some indicators of safety. For instance, when a given passage speaks about supernatural entities, but these analyses are performed in a way which resemble some abstract philosophical scrutinies, when the whole matter is put in the context of Jewish halacha, which is the Jewish law, or when everything resembles a medical treatise, then this feeling of fear is decreased. In other words, it was as if you read about something fearful and disgusting, but everything was put in a medical treatise. The next indicator was disgust. And if a given passage concerns the matter of physiological processes such as defecation or urination, if it speaks about various bodily disfigurements or various dermatological diseases which are supposed to evoke this feeling of disgust, or if a given account concerns places which are disgusting, like cemeteries containing the decaying bodies, privy containing the human waste, and so on and so forth, then the presence of these hashtags contributes to the component of disgust. The final two indicators, reality and mystery, rely strictly on the formal features. Reality is a separate and a very complex subject. However, there are some reasons to believe that the accounts transmitted in the Babylonian Talmud differ significantly in how real they appeared for the authors. There are some indicators like language or attribution to specific sage, which allow us to speculate about the perceived reality of a given fragment. Finally, the last final measure, mystery, concerns the volume of the text. It cannot be too long because it loses its horrifying power. Now, if we have a look at the calculating sheet, you can see that it works like this. We have a specific fragment. We have all the categories used to annotate a specific fragment. And here we have the section which aggregates points for specific categories. The calculating algorithm is quite complex. I will be more than happy to describe it in the questions and answer section. We can measure specific components of this horror compound, but the question is, can we find some unified measure, or in other words, how do we find points of horror using all these elements? And to answer this question, I devised as an algorithm, which I now want to dissect into three parts and explain each one. The first part of the algorithm, which is described, which is portrayed in here in a very simplified form. The first part of algorithm is used to exclude the fragments speaking about supernatural entities which do not meet the criteria of horror. For instance, we can have an account which is very real and very disgusting, but it's not fearful. Or we can have a fearful fragment which is not disgusting. And we can have all kinds of combinations. However, we don't have this basic fourfold complex of fear, disgust, mystery, and probability. And this fragment of algorithm excludes all these fragments which do not meet the basic criteria. The second part of the algorithm is the exact formula which is used to calculate the horror points. In its present form, it's very simple. I will probably change it in the future. However, it is something I would say quite intuitive. You sum up all the components and deduce from it safety. Last part of the formula indicates whether the given fragment is of appropriate length. The shorter and more to the point it is, the more additional points it can get. The question is how to name the unit of horror, and I hereby propose to use a category of one dagon of horror for three main reasons. Now, the first one is, well, obviously, this is a Lovecraftian, mostly Lovecraftian conference. A second, Dagon is, at least in my opinion, one of his least scary novels, and it actually makes sense because you don't want to have milli-dagons and centi-dagons in the future, so you want to keep it as simple as possible. And finally, Dagon has some Semitic background. So you have Semitic Dagon, Semitic Babylonian Talmud. Well, it goes well together. Now, the results, which is obviously we all want to see. It is not that surprising that overall, after analyzing all the fragments of the Babylonian Talmud, it turned out that Babylonian Talmud in total is not that much fearful or not that much disgusting. As you can see, the numbers are very, very low. Given the fact that each unit could get maximally 21 points for fear and 4 for disgust, neither of the accounts got the maximum points. On the other hand, reality is quite differentiated. But as I said, this is a different story. From all the Talmudic units, from all the Talmudic fragments speaking about supernatural entities, it turned out that only 19, which is slightly more than 2% of contents, of the contents involving supernatural entities, only 19 units qualified. It means that, again, on the overall scale, the Babylonian Talmud is not that scary. However, there is a number of accounts which have some potential to be horrifying. And when we have a look at these qualified units, and when we have a look at these averages and maximum points, it turns out that it is actually what differentiates the qualified units from the rest of the Talmud. They are on average a bit more fear-evoking, a bit more disgusting, and they appear a bit more real, which actually follows from the formula. Obviously, we don't have time to analyze all these 19 units. However, I would like to show you the most horrifying account of the Babylonian Talmud, which, honestly speaking, I was quite surprised to find. This is the present fragment from tractate Psachim, which speaks about certain type of demons which can be found in certain conditions, especially in the shades or in the woods. And the passage tackles some practicalities associated with this specific figure. Here, in the right low corner, we have the profile, the horror profile of this passage, and as you can see, it's very real. It is transmitted in Aramaic in a form which allows us to believe that the contents were perceived by the authors as very, very real. It is fearful and disgusting at the same time. So we have this basic triad involved in here. It provides no means of securing oneself. And this is quite important because this increases the feeling of horror and it reduces the feeling of this idea of control. And it has appropriate length, and this is the most horrifying passage from the involving supernatural entity from the Babylonian Talmud. Conclusions. First and foremost, the method I devised here obviously needs calibration. That in fact it needs a whole bunch of things: better theoretical grounding, more tests, more the control group, and so on and so forth. One of the main problems is that the component of disgust is heavily underrepresented. I need more indicators of disgust in the future. However, with that being said, I believe that what I was able to show with this method, that we can take a work which is apparently a non-horror work and analyze it using these horror indicators. On a final note, I can add that I wish to apply this specific measure in my further research, and I hope to find some regularities pertaining to the quality of horror and, let's say, some other formal features. But as always, it is the subject for another presentation. Thank you very much.